Hi, I'm Anne. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing a mid-month reading wrap-up for the books I've read this month. I have been doing so much reading this month. I'm not even joking how overwhelmed I am with reading. And I think next month I'm just going to participate in no readathons, do very little of any reading that isn't mood reading, because this month was a bit too much, because so far I haven't really been able to read any like extra books. The first two books I read were actually cozy mysteries that I got one from NetGalley that I didn't have to request it. It was just like you could read it on NetGalley, and then I realized it was the second book of a series, so I quick got the first book in the series, and that is the Homefront News Mysteries by Joyce St. Anthony. There's two books out. Well, actually the second book isn't out yet. I believe it comes out in a couple months. But the first one is The Front Page Murder, and the second one is Death on a Deadline. And I gave these both 4 stars. They're very light, enjoyable mysteries. They follow this young woman whose father ran a newspaper, and she worked for her father, but he's gone off to participate in World War II, and because of that, she's left alone in charge of the newspaper. So it's kind of her struggles as well as like mysteries, murders that are happening in her town in different books that she has to solve. So it's like historical cozy mystery. That's the best way to describe it. And I have talked about how I'm a little bit sick of World War II books. World War II historical fiction, I just think it's such a period that is so overdone. However, I really enjoyed this one just because it was light. I didn't have to like worry about it. And it was a good way to start off this month because it was really encouraging just to have like an easy read, especially since while I was reading that, I was also reading Malice by John Gwynne. And this is like a 600-page fantasy that, yeah, I really struggle with this. This is my husband and I did a full review for this that went up Wednesday. So if you are curious to hear like my full thoughts and his full thoughts, I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. And in fact, this was the second time I read it, and the first time I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, and now I gave it 5 out of 5 stars because it is a challenging book to read. And I really struggled with it the first time, and this time I took my time with it. And I really enjoyed it. So yeah, I will say I was surprised how many books I am reading this month are extremely long. So for the 2 books I read for Ancientsathon, which is going on this month, I've read 2 books so far for it, so I'm right on track, which is good because the other readathon I'm doing, June on the Range, this month, I also have 2 books done with it. So yeah, it's both readathons are going well. The first one I read is Love and the Turning Year, 100 More Poems from the Chinese. And it pulls from a lot of like classic Chinese poets, like Lu Du, who was like really big in the Tang Dynasty. I've read some of his poems before. And I really enjoyed this translation particularly. I got this book from one of my professors, and her expertise was Asian history, especially Chinese and Japanese, so she probably knows what she's talking about. And I feel like it's really hard to translate poetry, especially into English, and this one was pretty well done. I enjoyed reading them. Most of them are about like getting older and changing times. It does say, you know, love in the turning year, so it makes sense how like romance and growing older and change is foremost in the topics that these poems discuss. But I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, especially since this was such a like easy read to read. So I enjoyed that because the second book I just finished is the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer. I have been meaning to read this for years. I actually read the first like 3 or 4 stories a couple years back, and I just never got around to finishing it because it is, I mean, my copy is about 500 pages, and I just made a video like a week ago of Penguin Classics and wondering, are they overhyped? And after reading this, I'm like, yeah, they're overhyped because I did not like this translation. I actually switched to audiobook and I preferred that translation more. What I really disliked about this one is 2 of the tales, and possibly my favorite tale, which is the tale of Melody was my favorite tale, and it is a prose tale. So Neville Coghill actually didn't translate the prose tales. So most of this is told in like poetry format, And all of that he translated, but he didn't translate two of possibly the best tales. This is an abridged version, and it doesn't say it anywhere on it. And yeah, I got this from like the Goodwill, I think, for like $2. So it's not like I'm out much money, but I do want to invest in a unabridged copy of this book now. I actually switched to the audiobook version, was the Dover Classic version. And it was actually like an all-star cast where you had like multiple voices depending on who was telling the story. I really enjoyed this book. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I was surprised how varied the tales were. Some were just, 5 pages long and very short. And some were like 50 pages long and like a whole saga. So it was interesting to see just how different. But I'm getting distracted. This book follows these group of pilgrims that are traveling to Canterbury, where Thomas Becket was murdered by Henry III? Henry III? I don't remember, one of the Henrys. And because of that, Canterbury had become, in the, say, 1400s or 1300s when this was written, become very much a pilgrimage spot where, you would travel to that place and you would meditate on Christ and morality and Christianity and things like that. So this was a typical thing that people did during that time, and these group of people are traveling together, and they're like, hey, let's make the road fun by having each person tell a different story. That's the overarching plot of this book. And a lot of the stories are very much morality tales. Don't seek revenge because it will lead to horror. Be careful who you love. It's funny because like one story is like, yeah, women kind of are horrible and can seduce you and be horrible. And then the next one is like, women can be amazing and wonderful wives and very hardworking and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, I'm getting conflicted opinions here. But for the most part, I really enjoyed this book. On one hand, it has a surprisingly amount of things that apply to the modern world for being like written in 1400, but it also feels very much of its time. So it has traditional and social norms of the Middle Ages. But it also has a surprisingly wonderful amount of very modern feeling messages too. For example, my favorite story, which is the Melody story, basically his wife Prudence, who is my favorite character featured in this entire book. He's trying to decide whether to seek revenge on his enemies, and all his other advisors are like dismissing her opinion because she's a woman. And then she goes off for like 20 to 30 pages on just beautiful advice to him as to like how to seek good advice and how to trust certain advisors above other ones, and don't trust the majority always. And it's just such a brilliant story, especially since you think of the Middle Ages and you think of, yeah, women didn't have many rights then, but then you see so many of these characters, female characters, having such beautiful and articulated opinions. And a lot of the men listen to them, which is really cool. Because I feel like you need that balance, even in our modern world. You need to have more of the feminine voice of opinions, but then you also need to have the male voice of opinions. That's just my opinion. All right, the next 2 books I read were for my book club. And the first one was The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett, which is such an overhyped book. I actually had average feelings about it. So it follows these twin sisters, Stella and Desiree, who the town they come from, basically the whole point of the town is to create Black people who have the lightest skin possible. So basically you would have like lighter Blacks having babies with lighter Blacks until it just gets lighter and lighter and lighter. And so both Desiree and Stella have almost white skin, like they could pass as white, which comes in prominently later on in the book. So they grow up in this like tiny little town. It takes place, the story, I think it starts in the 40s when the twins are born, and then it goes all the way to, I would say 80s, but it might go into the 90s. But so these girls grow up in this town and they decide to leave. And Stella vanishes when they are in Chicago, and Desiree returns home, having been in an abusive relationship, and now she has a daughter that is very dark. What is the daughter's name? Kennedy is Stella's daughter's name. Jude. Yeah, I was right. So Jude is Desiree's daughter, and then so you have two timelines going on. You're trying to piece together where Stella went, what Desiree's life is like, and then you have Jude and Kennedy. Kennedy is the daughter of Stella, and Stella ended up marrying a white man and kind of pretending to be white, because, you know, she is mostly white. And then you have Jude, because her father was so dark-skinned, she is treated very badly. Here are the good things about this book. I love the social commentary of not only how like racial issues were going on during that time, but also just like how darker blacks were treated differently than, say, lighter blacks, which was really interesting commentary. I also enjoyed Stella and Desiree's characters. I really understood them well. Also, if you hear like growling, Loki is down there playing with his toy and being very loud. I'm sorry. But when we got to Jude and Kennedy, the daughters of the twins, I did not like either of their characters. I didn't like either of their perspectives. Kennedy is like this kind of spoiled actress, and yeah, didn't care for her character. Jude, again, like I did not care about any scene. She's kind of trying to piece together where Stella is and trying to trace her. I didn't like two of the four main perspectives. I don't know, the book fell flat for me, especially for how hyped it was. I still gave it 3 stars. I liked it, but I didn't think it was as amazing as everybody seems to think. And the next one is The Wrong Family by Taryn Fisher. I don't know what I just read with this book, but it was interesting. It follows this family and this woman who's living with this family in this family's house. And the family has secrets. They might have stolen a baby. And yeah, so you follow mostly the perspective of the woman living in the house as well as the wife of the house. I feel like it's hard to not give spoilers because like most of this book is spoilers, but this book felt like a massive soap opera. It was just so dramatic and over the top. I never really felt the thrilling elements. Either the book was like super boring at one scene, and then the next scene it would be like, here, let's throw in 20 plot twists at one point. And the ending was just like, really? Okay. So yeah, I ended up giving this 1 star, which maybe I was a bit too critical, because like after I finished it, I was like, this is a horrible book, so I gave it 1 star. But looking back, you know, maybe it was closer to 2 stars, but I'm still gonna stay with 1 star. All right, the next book I read, and the only book this month so far I've finished that is not from my TBR this month, that is Jane Austen's England by Roy A. Adkins. This is a nonfiction kind of documenting the life of people and understanding the world in which Jane Austen grew up in. And it was really fascinating, especially since we think of this idyllic countryside type living from Jane Austen's books, but in reality, it was much more of like the industrial era was coming up. There were factories, textile factories that were opening up. There were major issues with poverty. So there's a lot of interest in the world, and I love this book. I actually gave it 5 out of 5 stars. It was just so good, so informative, especially for next month. I'm not participating in Jane Austen July, but Jane Austen July is a readathon where you try to read, well, the only rule is you have to read 1 Jane Austen book, but one of the prompts is that you read like either a biography of Jane Austen or like a nonfiction on Jane Austen, and this one I highly recommend if you are participating in Jane Austen July because it was so informative, especially since it broke down a lot of the stereotypes that are contained in Jane Austen's books. Next one is the second book of the Lee Do series, The White Mirror by Elsa Hart. I talked about the first book last month in my wrap-up. This is just like a murder mystery set in 18th century China. This one, it was interesting because this monk is believed to have killed himself, but Lee Do pieces together he's mysteriously murdered. And there's a lot having to do with like spies, especially spies dealing with the relationship between Tibet and China. It's a really great mystery. There's not that much to say about it. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. All right, the next one was Gory Details, Adventures from the Dark Side of Science by Erica Engelhaupt. So this book was for the Black Hearts Book Club that is hosted by Very Literary Carrie. And this book was interesting. So it's a nonfiction. Engelhaupt, very German name. She runs this blog, I believe, where she documents these like horrifying medical and scientific diseases and infestations and things like that. For example, one of the chapters talks about insects and bugs getting into like your orifices, like in your nose and things like that. Pretty disgusting stuff. So basically the book is all about these like horrific scientific biology stuff that we don't really talk about. So I would say insects feel like they are half the book. Like half the book is focused on like insects of some sort. But there's a lot of interesting stories within here. Each chapter is very short. You know, they're maybe like 5 pages. So it's really easy to like read a chapter every day or whatever. I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. I think it's maybe closer to like 3.5 because there was a lot I enjoyed in this book. But I also felt like at times there were just certain ways that Engelhaupt described things that were meant to be dramatic and to be horrific and to like traumatize the reader. And I just thought it was a little bit over the top with like the grossness, because a lot of the things talked about in this book, like the whole social idea of eating insects, that's not something that is really gross. We just think it's gross because that's how our society, you know, sees that type of stuff. So yeah, it was a good book. It was really interesting though. So for June on the Range, I have finished 2 books. The first one is Log of a Cowboy by Andy Adams. This one was a great book. I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. So Andy Adams was an author in the early 1900s, maybe late 1800s, that his father fought in the Civil War, and then in the 1880s, he was actually a cowboy. Cowboys traditionally were these men that would drive cattle between states to be sold at auction. So specifically this story was written because Andy Adams was annoyed that there was this romanticization of being a cowboy, and it wasn't realistic to actual life on the range type. So he wrote this book. It is fictional, but it's based on his real life experiences of being a cowboy. And it was interesting because, so it follows this young man, Tom, I think the main character is called, because it's told from his perspective, almost as like a diary format. And he is on a cattle drive, a 5-month cattle drive in 1886, I don't remember the year, from Texas to Montana. And so he documents his journey there, and it is an exceptional book. It has those like adventure moments where like, oh, will they have like a gun pulled out at them at a bar, or like are these cattle thieves that are riding up to them? But then there's also a lot of like dramatic but also realistic moments. For example, being really hungry on the trail, having to deal with like extreme heat of Texas, where especially since like when I was reading it, it was like 90 degrees outside. So I was like, yeah, dude, I can relate. If I was out there like driving cattle in this weather, I would die. So yeah, I'm a prissy city girl, clearly. But this was an exceptional book. Really interesting, all the scenes. The only criticism I have was it's not politically correct. For example, his horse, he names N-boy as in the N-word, which that was strange to hear. The first time I heard it, I was like, wait, what? I like misheard because I was listening to this on audiobook and I was just like, what's happening here? A century ago, that language wasn't politically incorrect. It was probably politically correct and socially correct. So yeah, it was weird to hear that. And like, it did grate on my nerves just a little bit, but it's still an exceptional book and I highly recommend it. The second book I read for June on the Range was Bridge of the Gods, A Romance of Indian Origin by F.H. Buck. So Buck lived amongst, and I can't remember what tribe. It said in the introduction of the book, like he lived with a couple different Indian tribes in the Oregon Territory. And he took a lot of notes and writings on like their traditions and their superstitions and things like that. Because the Bridge of the Gods, the title comes from the mythology that some of the Indian tribes followed. The story follows this missionary from New England who his wife dies and he decides to go be a missionary Northwest Territories. And in that he gets kind of drawn in these conflicts between different Indian tribes. This Indian tribe, that's kind of the center focus of it, is trying to get together this confederacy of Indians to become more powerful. So you have both the missionaries coming into Indian territory, and then you also have the conflicts between different Indian groups. I gave it 3 out of 4 stars. I didn't dislike it, but it's a lot less... I feel like it doesn't really capture a lot of the Indian society, and it makes them almost like very stylized people. And there's not exactly anything wrong with that, but it also feels like it's very surface level understanding of them. And because of that, he makes them seem very like superstitious, over the top, very like cunning, very the stereotype Indian. And I understand that was a stereotype that was common during the time, but for someone who lived amongst Indians for years, I was a little bit disappointed that a lot of the Indian tribes weren't as developed as they could be. There are a couple Indians, like the Indian chief I mentioned earlier, who were more developed, and I really enjoyed his character. I also enjoyed his daughter's character. Hey, what are you doing? But for the most part, I was underwhelmed with how the Indians, how the Native Americans were developed. So those are all the books I finished so far. I can't believe I finished 12 books in the first half of the month, which is a lot. I guess it's more than half the month now, but I definitely won't be finishing all my TBR for this month, but I am starting off strong and I am completing like, hey, I am happy with how many books I have been reading so far. So have you read any of these books? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you like this video, like, subscribe. I post every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday at 6 p.m. Eastern time. And I will see you all in the next video. Have a great week. Bye.